And welcome to Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. This evening I am going to be talking about a photo shoot I did for a band called the Yahs a few years ago, which was a lot of fun. Technique-wise, I'm going to be discussing the notion of leading lines, and then of course the last half of the show will be looking at submitted photos, giving some feedback and critique on them. I will be periodically checking the Facebook comments, so do feel free to, if you want, leave a question or even a message of encouragement. Wouldn't be too bad. We're only on episode 5, and whilst I generally speaking, think I kind of get into the flow of it a few minutes in, the opening couple of minutes is still a bit nerve-wracking. Right, okay, so first thing I want to talk about is the photo shoot I did with a band called Sparo and the Yahs. So if I flick over to that, you should be able to see this. And the thing about the Sparo and the Yahs, they were a fantastically fun live band to see. If anybody here ever actually got to see them live, again, do leave a message in the comments if you've got any fond memories of them. The good old rock and roll, basically, and you got Grant sitting here in the middle. Brilliant front man. And he still is. He's in a bunch of different bands and stuff, but also theatre. But with the Yahs, he was sort of strut his stuff across the stage like a kind of cross between Mick Jagger and James Brown. A real charisma, a real energy, and absolutely backed up to the hilt by Ali on bass, Dave on guitar, and Fergus on drums. They really were just an awful lot of fun. And so anyway, we got to the point whereby they needed a photo. They were going to be releasing their album, and so they needed a cover. So the thing had to be designed to fit on a square. And we talked and bounced ideas around, and it's very easy to go down the route of holding the instruments. 4 blokes in front of a garage door looking moody, kind of thing. But we didn't feel we wanted to do that. Part of the story, one of the sort of fun aspects of the Yahs, was they always kind of made out that Grant, the lead singer, was a little bit of a diva, and the others had to sort of run around after him. Now, I don't actually think that was the case. Maybe, I don't know, Dave, Ali, or Fergus are actually listening in and leave a note in the comments to correct me. But it was part of the story of them. And so the idea then came up, well, what if we had sort of Grant sitting in the middle while the others were waiting on him, literally hand and foot? And so this seemed like quite a fun idea. And so we thought, well, we needed something something a bit like a throne would be good. And immediately the thought came up for Cumberland Castle, which was a place they played quite often, with the sort of wedding. It was a great wedding venue, and they would often play sometimes as a kind of wedding band. And they had these fantastic carved wooden chairs and this sort of big coat of arms in the reception area. So we thought we could maybe use this. Now, what was kind of interesting with this is how the photo developed as we went. So what I'm going to do this time is I want to show you actually the set of photos that built up to this. It's about a dozen or so. And part of this is because it's something I never see. And certainly when I was sort of at the beginning of when I was sort of setting out photography, my God, I would have killed for this. You see the photo, you see the finished product, and this is the finished edited version. And maybe sometimes you see the unedited version and you can track how things were edited. But you never get to see the photos that didn't work. in the set, or the photos that we're building, where you're watching the photographer chase the idea. So I thought it might be interesting for you if I show you some of the previous photos. So if I'm going to start with this one. So what we've got here is, this is a sort of a kind of a trial shot, a test out shot. I've got one light source, which, you know, off to the right of them. We've got Grant sitting in the chair. Now, my initial idea had been to sort of be at quite a low level, wide angle lens, looking up, kind of almost at foot level, and Fergus would be cleaning the shoe, cleaning Grant's shoe, Davey pouring him a cup of tea or coffee, and Ali combing the hair. Grant had got hold of a cigar as well to sort of add, and then his fancy jacket to kind of look a bit more rock starry, and of course his shades as well. So with that idea, that was my kind of rough thumbnail sketch. You can see it's quite different, and immediately it sort of, I thought, okay, this isn't quite working how I want it to. So let's see, move on to the next one. That's just a quick shot there, just kind of having a laugh, sort of fired off. So now I'm trying to get a bit more serious. Now, one of the things I'd realised in the previous ones is it all seemed quite dark in the background, and I did have a sense of maybe I needed a second light. So I set up a second off-camera flash behind them. So if you go to here, you can now see, just peeking behind Dave's elbow there's a little light coming in, and it's just kind of lighting up, catching the corner of his hair here and lighting the background a little bit. But there's just a little, and it's amazing how much just that little bit of light can lift. In future episodes of this, I'm planning on doing a session talking specifically about backlighting. It is something of a kind of photographer's secret weapon. But I wanted to have that little bit of light at the back there, just to kind of separate them out from the background a bit, so they didn't get completely lost in shadow. But we're here now, but it's, rather than being a square picture, which is what we were going to need for an album cover, this is sort of very elongated diagonally. I try another shot, and now what you notice is I've kind of come up a little bit, head's tilted, arms away, so now the flash is showing right through, and that's not particularly useful. This one, inevitably what happens is one of the flashes doesn't go off, and in this case it was the main light obviously didn't go off. So this actually, I left this one in to show you, because it does show you actually what the backlight is doing for the picture. So it's like cursing the fact that I've taken the photo and the light hasn't gone off. Try another one, check that it's working. Again, Fergus's shoulder is now coming over him. We move on. Okay, so now I've adjusted them. So, okay, we're starting to get a bit of a shape here. Let's try leaning forward a bit. There's still something not quite right, and I'm still trying to figure it out. Play around a little bit more. I like the idea that Grant is now looking over the top of his glasses. I mean, if we go back to here, he's got his shades on, and what that does is it means that everything is enclosed. We are voyeurs or observers looking at this scene. We don't know whether Grant is looking at us or not. He's just sort of sitting there behind his shades. But as soon as we go to this, as soon as he's now looking at you, as the viewer, you now become part of the story. So the other guys are all supporting Grant, but now you are as well. And I really like that. I like that idea of getting him to stare straight into the camera over the top of the glasses. We're still playing around a bit, you know. Is he keeping the cigar up to one side? Is he bringing the cigar down? something's not quite right with Ali over on the right. Just doesn't seem to kind of sit right. He does his jacket up. He takes the jacket off. There's also the fact that when he's up here, he's feeling too high and too far away from Grant. There is an aspect here with photography where gaps tend to feel exaggerated in a photo. It's why your wedding photographer is always going closer, closer. Wherever there's a space, that space seems to be bigger in a photograph. I'll maybe talk more about that later or another time. But, I mean, in reality, Ali is really close to Grant. But there's this gap between them. So it doesn't quite look right. So he comes in closer. I mean, Ali's really pushing himself now up over the edge of the chair. But it's still not quite sitting right. So I decided, okay, let's swap everybody around. So we move Ali round. We swap Ali and Dave. As another little thing, as you can see, we gave up on the shoe shine and we just went for the lighting the cigar bit. Ali's still pouring the coffee, so Grant has swapped hands with the cigar. Is it really working? Let's try. So no, Ali's hands now in front of his face. Also at this point, somewhere along here, yeah, from here to here, one of the shifts you might notice is the coffee pot has changed. We've gone from a teapot to a shiny coffee pot, and actually I quite liked the reflections in there. So a lot of what this is doing is you're kind of going click, change, click, swap that, click, tinker with that bit, click, finesse that bit. The idea that anybody just sort of turns up, goes click, gets the perfect picture is just in the dreams or nightmares of people who don't really do photography much, or at an amateur level, or are feeling insecure, or are boastful lies by people who are trying to make themselves look good. You don't get the photo straight away, or if you do, it's so rare as to be a sort of once or twice in a lifetime. You really have to kind of keep playing with it. So where were we? Yeah, Ali's hand is now in front of his face. So and also what's happening is Dave is looking tall, and we've gone back to this kind of stretched out. So okay, let's swap around again, and now everybody shifts one place clockwise. Ali comes down, and suddenly I'm starting to think, we're getting close. You can taste it. You can almost smell it. There's you've got this idea, and you've got half an idea. I suppose there's a bit here where obviously it depends on the photographer. Every photographer's got their own style. Every photographer works in a slightly different way. There are some photographers who will sketch out to the nth degree in their thumbnail exactly what they want their picture to look like, and then the photo is constantly being referred to against the picture to see how well it matches up. I don't. I have an idea, but it's a sort of loose idea, and because a lot of times I can't visualize actually that clearly until I've got everything in front of me. I'm one of these people, I find it much easier to adjust something that's there than I do to come up with something completely original. You know, give me a blank piece of paper and I will just stare at a blank piece of paper forever. Give me a few words and I can start writing a sentence, or I can start taking a story off in lots of different directions. Give me a person, give me a background, and then I can start arranging it. So I go in with a kind of loose idea, and then sometimes first guess you're pretty close. Sometimes first guess you just go, it's not working. But now at this point, where I can't remember, probably about 20 minutes into the shoot or something, and it's starting to take shape, and I'm feeling, right, we're on to something here. Now, as you can see, the light is cutting through from Ali, but we're ever so close, and Ali is looking at the cigar. If you look at his gaze, it's bringing you down to the cigar here. And at this point, I just said, well, look at Grant rather than the cigar. Okay, next shot. Yes. There. That's what happened. So let's just run back a little bit. So Backlight hasn't gone off. Ali's smirking a bit. Well, everybody's kind of smirking a bit, really. Ali's now looking more serious, but he's looking at the cigar. And then Ali looks directly at Grant. And that is like the final shift in the puzzle. And now it has a new kind of that energy that I wanted. And I knew I could crop in the sides and I would have something. And then the final edited image is looking like this. So now it's been edited to have a kind of painterly look to it. That was, part of the design. But so you can see it now works square. However, there is another point here, which is this is where I screwed up with the cropping. For anybody who was watching episode 1, and I talked to begin with about cropping an image and understanding how the image is going to be used. And one of the things I talked about was that if a picture is going to be used in print, you have to understand that there's a 3mm bleed that goes around the edge. You need to make sure that picture, when printed, can withstand being 3mm bigger than it actually needs to be, because bits will get cut off. And this is the one where I learnt that the hard way, because I designed this and I built this and I was very happy with it. But if I just drop this into Photoshop, if I pull this in a bit like that, oops, sorry about that, press the wrong button. So pull that to there, that to there, and get rid of that 3mm. And now the top of Fergus's hair has just got tripped off. Ali's leg down here is just sort of like this extra little dark patch that isn't really making any sense. And it just doesn't work quite as well as when you've just got that little bit more room to breathe. So now I know this. There's a lovely phrase, experience is something you gain immediately after you needed it the most. There are times when I feel I think of this phrase on a near daily basis. But this was certainly one of those cases. I designed the photo. I was really pleased with it. The guys were really pleased with it. We're all thinking, whoopee, it's a great photo. It goes off to get printed onto the album. And then when the album comes back and I get a copy of it, I suddenly realise it's cropped in much closer than I wanted it to be. I mean, it still works, but it doesn't work quite as good as it could have. And when you're a photographer, when you're a designer of any kind, you've got an idea in your head. It's one of those things, every time I look at the album, I just wince a little bit because I know I got it wrong on that bit. I still do listen to the album. Unfortunately, the guys split up many years ago. They're all amazing musicians and crop up in different bands all the time. But I always did love watching the Yahs live. So that's one of the things I wanted to, that's really kind of what I wanted to talk to about the Yahs. I will just take a quick check-in on the Facebook, see if I have anything. Oh, great, of course. Fergus. I'd be delighted with a haircut. I'm delighted with a haircut at the moment, Kim. Brilliant, Fergus. Thank you. Yeah, obviously we're all in lockdown. That's Pat. Metal teapot is better. No, yeah, absolutely. And I love the reflections in the teapot. So what else have we got? Keith. Hi, Kim. Back this week. Hi, Keith. Good to see you. Pat. Hi. And Brian. Great admirer of your work, Kim. Oh, well, thank you. Compliments always welcome. I have a cavernous ego. I can always take as many that you want to throw at me. So that's great. Let's flick back now. So the next thing that I wanted to talk about was the notion of leading lines. And for that, there's a whole So I've even seen competitions for photos, themed competitions where you talk about leading lines. And it's a really powerful compositional technique once you kind of start understanding what it is and how it works. Now, at its most basic, what I'll do is I'll pull up this photo. This one was taken in Morocco, and you will have seen photos like it. It's the kind of thing I always wanted to have a photo like this, and we were driving along and we had a little stop and the road was empty, and it's great, go and sit in the middle of the road and you get those fantastic lines, just sort of the vanishing point. And so the leading lines are, you have a really strong line running down the left, strong line running down the right, the dotted line running down the middle, and everything is leading you into the photo. It's leading you into the photo, and in this case to the mountain range in the distance. Having said that, beyond the leading lines, it's actually not that impressive a photo. You get a sense of emptiness, sure, that's nice, but the mountain range is at quite a distance. There's nothing in the foreground or midground to kind of grab your attention. So it's the kind of photo, at the time I took it, I was quite pleased with it. If somebody had thrown this into the critique section now, I would have probably said, yeah, I think you really need something else to give it a sense of scale. So another version, or another kind of photo also taken in Morocco in a different place, is this one. So again, what we've got is we've got the leading line, the road, taking us to this vanishing point. Only this time what we do have, whilst we've got the mountains in the distance, including a bit of snow on the mountains, we've also got this range of buildings kind of in the midground. And there's a little bit of texture and landscape just slightly further down towards us. So, I mean, as a picture, I think this one tends to work a little bit better than the last one. We've still got a road going into it, but there's a little bit more to look at. There's a sense of a purpose for leading us into this. You know, the last one, yeah, we got the leading lines, but kind of so what? Now we follow the road in, and then we notice buildings, and we notice mountains and landscaping and something. So there's something for our eye to actually be worth being drawn to. Let's take another one, a little bit closer to home. This is in Stranraer, over in the southwest corner of Scotland. The railway no longer goes there, as you can see by the kind of disused and rusty bits and pieces. And so here, and it's again one of these kind of photos you see a lot in online photo competitions and what have you, or sometimes camera club competitions. The idea that you've got the rails now instead of the road are the one that's drawing you into the photo. But there's an odd thing that goes on with this one, which is actually what is happening is I tend to feel the leading lines are actually drawing you away from where you want to be. The real interest in this photo is the foreground. You know, we've got these rusty bits of track end here. We've got so then the notion, if we're saying that what this story is about is essentially urban decay, then, you know, whether it's the, you know, peeled off paint of the danger of electric shock, these bits of rust, the plants overgrowing, coming out of the concrete, the broken down door, that's really where the story is. But when we look at, but what happens is these leading lines lead us straight down the middle. And down the middle, what have we got? We've got just some houses in the distance. You know, there's not a lot down there, really. That's not where the interest lies. The interest is actually in the foreground. And here we have the danger, then, of the fact that the leading lines are actually leading us away from what the story's about. So again, it's another one of these where initially I thought, oh, whoopee, this is great. Oh, I quite like this kind of look. And then upon reflection later on, I kind of came to realise that it was doing exactly the opposite of what I wanted to do. It's not leading us towards that notion of decay. It's leading us away from it, but not towards anything else in particular. So those are all examples of leading lines, straight lines, but they don't have to be straight. Let's flick back to Morocco. And this photo, which I was particularly proud of, is sunrise in the edge of the Sahara Desert. There's a whole amazing story behind that, which was a lot of fun. But what we're talking about here is the leading line of, let's just open that with Photoshop a moment, and then I can overlay, find the pencil tool, and now what we've got, because what I want to do is I want to talk about this line. So we've got this lovely kind of S-bend, or which just kind of curves around. We've also got this line that runs up here as well, and we've got the shadow line that runs up here, and then we've got these kind of lines which draw us here, and all these lines are then pulling us towards, we've got this really bright patch of the sun, but the moment you kind of come away from the sun, what we've got is we've got silhouettes of camels, and then we've got this guy here who's been off to go and bring one back that has started to wander off during the night or earlier in the morning. So the lines that are leading us into it here now are curved, and I like that curve and the way the sunlight is creating the shadows to create some of the straighter lines. But that curve of the sand dunes, I think, is really what makes this photo work in a more interesting way than just having the straight lines that taking you down a road. But then to bring this notion of leading lines back to the photo of the yahs. The photo of the yahs is relatively two-dimensional. David and Fergus are sort of slightly behind, but it's fairly compact. It's not got the depth of those Moroccan or Strand Ra photos. But that doesn't mean to say there aren't lines making themselves felt. And so this is the other idea of leading lines. You've got to think about what's pointing towards what. So again, if I just create a new layer here, then what happens? There's Fergus is, you've got Fergus's head here, and then the line kind of comes up round here. We're kind of clipping Davy and Fergus's comb, coming round Ali, his arms coming up here, and so we've got this kind of curve going around to where we've got Grant in the middle. But what we've also got is and I love it, is this look that's coming directly from Ali. You do follow the directions of eyes. In this case, Fergus is looking down at the comb, Dave is looking down at the coffee pot, but Ali looking straight at Grant gives us another directional bit. There's sort of back bits as well where Grant's cigar is pointing back up towards Ali. So there's a lot of, so really what the lines are doing here is drawing you in and moving you around the picture. There's a lot going on in this. There's lots of lovely little details. As just mentioned, the metal coffee pot. I love the little reflections of Ali's face in this. And so you don't just sort of look at it once. So there are little details in the background, but the movement of this is kind of keeping you in here. And then once you're in here, your movement's bringing you up round here. We've got movement coming back here. We've got movement going around here. So that notion of leading lines, the leading lines don't have to be going into the depth. They can be sideways. They can be drawing your attention to other aspects within the photo, even sort of crossways. So it's really worth thinking about where things are pointing. Where's somebody looking? When somebody's looking in a direction, you can see where their eyes are. You can't help but follow their gaze. You want to know what it is they're looking at. If somebody's pointing a cigar at something, or pointing a finger at something, or their arm is pointing in a direction, your eye just kind of naturally travels along that same line. So that's really what I wanted to say about the notion of leading lines. I think it's quite a powerful technique once you start getting into it. Now, it's one of these things you kind of have to do at the photography level. It's much harder to do in post-production. It's not to say it's impossible. I have done that in some photos. I've tweaked the angle of a cigar, or even in this one, I will say that Grant's collar here was in fact, where are we? Just move that. Grant's collar was in fact at that angle, and I deliberately moved it up to that angle so that it was an extra little line pointing up towards his eye. Again, as I've mentioned before, but in portraiture particularly, the front eye, the eye that's closest to the camera is like the most important part. Because he's looking at us, just a little nudge. I mean, it might not have made a lot of difference, but it's one of those things that when you're editing, you kind of get into these things, and sometimes you're literally pushing pixels around the screen because you're trying to chase down the idea. But I did want to have that notion. Right, okay, so I think that hopefully gives you a sense of the notion of leading lines as a compositional tool. So when you're out there with your camera, start thinking about in the composition, is there anything, even a branch sticking out, or a piece of wood, or an old piece of fence? I mean, obviously there's the whole thing of you find a lovely path that's leading into a picture, but are there other things within a picture which can draw your eye and point out other elements within the photo? Right, so now I'm going to go on to the actually, before I go on to the critique, I will just flick back over, see if we have any extra comments. Nina's come in. This is good for those who write too. It's about the way we see it. That's nice to know. Right, okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at the photos that were submitted for a bit of critique. There's not quite so much this week, I would say. It's an opportunity. If you want the feedback, we have the group Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, Facebook group. If you're not already attached to it, just search it in Facebook, you'll find it, and then join. It's an opportunity to then submit photos. If you've got photos where you feel, I quite like this photo, except for the fact it's not quite doing what I want it to, and I don't really know why, put it in, and I'll give you my feedback from my perspective. Or, it's an opportunity. There's a lot of times we can kind of get stuck. We get stuck with our own idea, or we're moving our photography forward, but we're too close to it. And it's damn near impossible to get decent feedback from other people. You put your photo up on Facebook, everybody goes, yay, it's lovely. And those who don't think it's lovely don't comment. So how do you know whether your photo is actually any good if you're only getting positive feedback, even when it maybe isn't up to much? Because people are being polite, they're being nice, they want to make you feel good, and there's nothing wrong in that, except that if you're trying to advance your photography, praise for the sake of it isn't actually helping you at all. Now there are some places out there where feedback can be brutal. Years ago I used to belong to a website which had a whole section dedicated to critique, and there were some absolute I was going to say tactless people, but they weren't tactless, they were doing it deliberately. They would sort of insult you for having made what they would call a schoolboy error or whatever, for not seeing something. And it was harsh and it wasn't very nice. But if you could get past the fact that they just seem to enjoy some kind of power trip, quite often they did also have something useful to say. I don't like that. I never like that notion of the power trip. So the critique I give will try and be always as tactful as possible. And it's always meant well. I want you to become a better photographer. I want the world to become better photographers. And I can help. So join the Facebook group, submit your photos during the week, and then I'll pick out ones for next week to give you feedback on. Now, the first one that I'm going to talk about tonight, I better start with VG, because VG's in India, which is 5.5 hours ahead of us, which means it's already 1:30 in the morning there. I keep telling her to just watch this on the repeat, and I keep finding out that she stays up all night to get the feedback, so I better get this one done quickly, or soon rather. Now, VG's text on this one. All right, one sec. I seem to have lost. All right, okay, here we go. So her comment was, this curved corridor took place, taken at a place called Sanchi Stupa. Sanchi Stupa? Unfortunately, my knowledge of Indian pronunciation is appalling, so forgive me if it's wrong. But it's a Buddhist monument built in the 3rd century BC. When I visited this place 3 years back, I was not prepared to see such huge structures. The whole place is predominantly filled with curved structures, the spherical tombs, the curved corridors, the round halls, and so on. I spent 8 hours wandering around taking photos. So as I walked through this curved corridor, there were 3 things that caught my eye. It was like a blind turn. At one point you could only see a few feet in front of you. The strips of light that fell through the gaps in the wall, everything went round and round. But I took lots of photos of the whole structure, but this one was just a part of the big picture. The photograph is not edited. There are elements in this photo, a bit of sky, some green rocks, yet it looks gloomy and haunted. I don't want to be vague. I will tell you what I want to see, what I would like to see out of the photo. At the right side of the wall, where it looks... actually, sorry, I've just realised I should be showing you this photo while I'm talking through this bit. And suddenly I've lost my bit of text. Right, okay, yeah, there we go. At the right side of the wall, it looks like it's where it looks like it's merging with the other. There should be a gap, some light, and a promise that there is more to the photo. Now everything looks like one big rocky mass. Okay, well, there's a lot in there, but basically, I kind of understand that we go. I mean, well, so this thing's been around for 1800 years. Incredible stone carvings. I mean, VG has sent me the high-res version of this. So if I zoom in here, you can see just the detail of carving all these elephants into the sandstone here. It must be just an amazing place to see. So we're in a place like that, and we're just wowed by it, and we pull out our camera and we start taking photos, and somehow the photos just are not capturing the sense of what we want. Now, it's a tricky one. I don't know what other photos VG has, but I think one of the things you're kind of up against is, well, there's a few things. Okay, let's first of all start talking about time of day. The light at the time of day. Now, you're fairly southern from us, but it doesn't look like there's a lot of shadow. So I'm imagining it's close to midday, probably somewhere between 11 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, at a very rough guess. So the shadows are kind of coming down. We can see that there's little lights coming through the shadows around here, which are quite pleasing. But you'd kind of wonder, if the sun was at a slightly different angle, how would they start to look? And I think there is a problem that quite often an overhead light, when you're trying to bring out details or you're trying to create an atmosphere, isn't always the best one. There's a reason. There's more than one reason why people like to shoot at the golden hour. The golden hour being usually the hour or so just after sunrise or the hour or so just before sunset. It's called the golden hour because the light is lower in the horizon. It's cutting through more atmosphere. It tends to create a slightly more yellow or gold shift to the light. So the light has got more gold quality. But it also tends to give more interesting shadow patterns. It allows you to really bring out the depth and texture of well, anything with texture really. So part of what we're up against here is there might have been other times of the day when the light might have been working better for you. We've also got the problem though of, to go back to the whole leading lines idea, which is the line is leading us here, or this line is leading us here. But there isn't anything here to look at. What we've got is, that's just textured wall. And primarily, I think that's kind of where we, compositionally, is where it's kind of probably the place where it's falling down the most. We have this structure here, which, when we zoom in, is beautiful, full of lots of things. But that in itself is like an add-on to the rest of it. For those who might remember last week, there's this lovely little interesting technique where you can do where if I just blur this beyond recognition, sort of something like that, so you're not making out any detail, then again, what you notice then is where are the lines, and without doubt, these are the lines. We've got this one coming down here, but this bit here isn't really so noticeable. Tonally, it's closer to the trees. So in colour, fine, we can see that there's a difference, but it's not standing out as much. So really with this, and then, okay, so there and one other aspect that I wanted to talk about is maybe the lens that you're using. Do you go for a kind of zoom lens or do you go for a wide angle? And well, a lot then depends on the kind of thing you're trying to get. A zoom lens will be good for going in and getting the detail, but a wide angle lens is really good for getting a sense of space. And even if you're in a narrow corridor, and sometimes almost especially if you're in a narrow corridor, you end up with more of the walls. But if this was a wider angle, I think it would give you more of that sense that you're in a tunnel, that you're in this pathway. It will give you a better sense of space. Now, obviously, all the things I'm talking about aren't things you can correct in Photoshop. But I think in terms of understanding photography, understanding why it might be working or might not be working, I would say the three things come down to the leading lines, which is everything we've been talking about this evening, the time of day, the light. I think could have been, well, it's kind of interesting because if the light had been too low, then maybe everything would have been in shadow. But and then basically the fact, I think the size, the kind of lens you used. So I hope that helps, Fiji. Like I said, I know it's not a lot about being able to correct this photo in particular, but maybe it will give you some ideas of, if you find yourself back in a place like this again, I'd be really tempted, try and get a wide angle lens, as wide as you can for whatever your budget is or whatever you can get hold of, and play with that. And I think you might find yourself pleasantly surprised at how much extra you can get, that sense of space and area, especially when you're right in the middle of it. So I hope that helps. Now, next up then, we're going to close that and have this one in from Graham. And Graham said, this one with seed trays, I just wanted it to say allotment in that English country kind of way. And in a way, again, I suppose at the moment, what with lockdown, for those people who are fortunate enough to have an allotment or a garden, growing has become, a major, well, it's a pastime. But it's also possibly cutting down on your food bills if you can grow some of your own as well. So this kind of resurgence in planting your own flowers and food is obviously quite a thing of the moment. So he wants it to say, Graham wants it to say allotment, and it kind of does. We've got here in the foreground, we've got a trowel, we've got seedling boxes ready to be planted. In the background, we've got raised beds, we've got the plants growing, we've even got an out of focus watering can. So it's got the elements, but it doesn't particularly feel like that much of an engaging photo. Part of it, again, is light. It's obviously taken on a fairly dull day. Now, that's not necessarily about... a lot of gardening is done on dull days. But at which point, I think you've got to take more advantage of the dull. It's like if you can take photos of rain. There's a whole way of doing that where really you've got to have a light source behind the rain if you want to try and make it effective. I don't think if it is raining here, I can't tell, but everything does look a bit damp. But at the moment, the lighting just feels a bit dull. There's not a lot really going on for it. You can boost this a bit. If I go to, do the quick sliders with camera raw, I can brighten it a little bit, pull a bit more out of the shadows, lighten it up a little bit. I could give it a yellow shift to make it seem slightly brighter day, or a blue shift to give it a slightly cooler temperature. I can play with the clarity, just sort of contrast it up a little bit more. You can do something like that and immediately looks a bit brighter. It's improving it a little bit, but how much? I think this square, part of the big problem really with the composition here is that you're drawn to the bit which is in focus, which of course is this bit. But this bit is occupying just the tiny bottom end of the photo. And then the vast majority is this big blurred area behind. I think really, compositionally, if you wanted this to be in focus, you'd have been better off maybe being at a slightly lower angle, having these bits in focus, and then having the rest of the plants in the garden, blurring out behind you. If we, just quite simply, if we crop this down a bit, something like that, I think it already becomes a slightly more interesting photo. Maybe put it in a little bit more, something like that. And now what we can see is that this bit is taking up much more of... So the story becomes much more about the bits you've got in focus, and you're not getting it overwhelmed by that big mass of picture which isn't in focus. And the bit that I keep coming back to week after week, and will always come back to, is the notion of what's the story, what's contributing to the story, what's detracting from the story. And what you're trying to do here is say trowel and seedlings ready to plant. That's where the story is, with the background is supposed to be adding to that, but not overwhelming it. And the big problem with with the starting point with that photo, I think, is just the background is too big and too overwhelming, and the main focal point is just sort of stuck right down at the bottom of the picture. So my suggestion is, when you get, if this is your allotment, and when you get back to it, then play around with the angles a bit more. Get down to, play with some literally sort of down in the earth levels as well. That can be fun. Or get on a step ladder and have some sort of aerial views. Play around with the angles. But again, so a part of the problem with this is it is very much taken, I suppose, at head height. It's sort of where you would be standing. And I think photos very often become quite interesting when you move away from your standard eye level, where you get higher or you get lower, where you change the angle, you look down from above, or you look up, or you look through. So I hope that gives you a sense, Graham, of this one. That if you want to get the allotment, you know, there's other ways of doing it, and you know that where the main point of your story needs to be more dominant for it, and the background needs to be the supporting part rather than the overwhelming part. And then next image, or the last image, I have another one from Graham, which is, this is his dog called Fergus, and he's wondering about the lighting. Now, this is one of those things. Pet portraits isn't necessarily my strong point, but having said that, portraiture is portraiture to an extent, and lighting is lighting. Now, there are elements of this, and I can kind of see what Graham, that notion of backlight again, with the window behind the dog, we're getting it lit up. Now, the problem is the light is too bright, is way too bright here. You know, in fact, even to the point whereby my white pen doesn't show up. So let's stick that in black. This is massively white, overbearing kind of stuff. And the exposure means that it's just whited out, and even some of the highlights in the dog's fur have whited out a bit too much. But I can also understand the other problem, which is if you adjusted the exposure to make sure that the behind wasn't so bright, then actually what would have happened is the foreground down here would have then become terribly underexposed, and it would have just been too dark. I mean, I can't get the details out directly, but if I sort of drop the contrast so that, say, that background is more what you would expect it to be in light levels, we're not getting the detail because that's blown. You can see here in the foreground that the coat of the dog has just been lost, so we've lost the detail. So it's where do you expose for, and if you expose for the dog's fur, everything whites out behind. If you expose for the background, everything in the foreground becomes too dark. This is actually where a reflector of some kind would come in. Now, whether you've actually got an actual reflector, or a sheet of white card, or even a sheet of white card with a bit of tin foil on it, a reflector will bounce the light back. So if you had a reflector sort of forward and to one side of your dog, sorry, sort of here really, then you expose a bit more so it's darker over in the corner, but you then, some of that window light bounces back. Now, you don't have it literally hanging over, you have to have it sort of slightly behind where the camera would be. Obviously you don't want it in shot, but if you can bounce some of that window light back towards the dog, then suddenly this all lights up again, and you then, so you don't end up with the blown highlights, but you do then still get the detail. So if you don't have off-camera flashes and what have you, but you do quite like the way your dog's sitting there, and if your dog is likely to stay there long enough for you to go and grab a piece of card, so sheet of white card, and if you want to make your own, a sheet of white card, have it sort of white card on one side, put a bit of tin foil over the other side of it, and then you can, and that will give an even bigger reflection, and then you can decide how strong a reflection of light you want by which side you want to put it. You'd be amazed at just how much difference that can actually make, filling in the shadows. With this as it is, I mean, the first thing, obviously, we go back to the cropping. Fergus the dog's head is smack bang in the middle, and everything we talked about with rule of thirds before. If we take this down and we allow for the snout, perhaps, I'll just kind of pull that up a little bit here. So the snout is running basically along it's now running along that third line there. So we do that. That automatically, I think, gives us a slightly better shape. What we then also become very aware of is this big red box in the background. So at that point, I suppose what we go in and is we use something like the clone tool and just start painting out the box. So that splash of red, because it's not just a box, it's red, and red is just grabbing the eye, grabbing the attention. It's obviously a bit bright, and I'm doing this very, very quickly. Let's just kind of blur that in a little bit more, something like that. Well, we now still do have quite a bright patch here, and a bright patch over here, and a bright patch down here. At this point, I'd be tempted to sort of start creating and playing with a vignette. So if I go up to camera raw here, and I flick over to lens correction, vignetting, and literally drag the slider in. That way you can go out of the way and brighten the outside, but I'll do that. And you can immediately see it's darkening down some of this. And if I do it again, well, that's maybe slightly overkill, but this is now not grabbing your attention quite so much, and your attention is getting a little bit more brought back to here. So now if we then go into camera raw, I think if we start bringing a little bit more detail out the shadows, play a little bit with the clarity now and texture, we start getting a bit more texture in the fur. And I think that becomes a little bit more interesting. And then what I might also do at this point is play around with a little bit of dodge and burn. So you take the dodge, which allows me to make, in this case, I'm using the midtones a little bit lighter. So if I do that, you'll notice, if I just the history here, just make the eye a little bit lighter, or the light parts of the eye a little bit lighter. And then maybe a little bit of burn, which will make the shadows just a touch darker. So we're making quite a bit of difference here. You can, if you want, play around with the dodge tool and create a few more highlights on the texture of the fur where it's hidden in the shadows. Something like that. And you could even just, with the burn tool, very, very quickly and lightly, just maybe take it around the highlighted bits and create that little bit of contrast. So at this point then, what we're talking about is that's the original photo, that's the mucks around with one. Maybe you prefer the original one, that's fine too. All I'm doing here is trying to show you that the big problem that you've got with the original is that you've lost various bits of, you've got blown highlights and things kind of, so I think there's room to play. With the photo, but your first problem. But what we're doing here is we're trying to correct something that was kind of where it went wrong at the point we took the photo. The photo would have been better if you'd made the exposure adjustment for the window light. So this would have meant that that your the highlights wouldn't have blown on the edge here. But you'd had some kind of reflector to bounce that light back to fill in the shadows down here. And then, like I say, after that, it's a case of cropping it and just making sure the composition is there. So I'm hoping that will have helped with that then, Graham. So that's pretty much the critique side of things now. If you found the whole thing interesting, by all means, please have a think about giving a donation. You'll see just down there, underneath where it says Facebook Live, if you paypal.me/Kim Ayres. It's not compulsory, but it is always appreciated. This has gone out live. I will be the recorded versions of this go onto YouTube. So if you just come in at the end and within 24 to 48 hours, I'll have a version on YouTube. You can also go to youtube.com/Kim Ayres. Excuse me a sec. You can then easily find the 4 previous episodes without having to scroll down through Facebook forever to find them. So I've got a channel playlist called Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres, so you can go and find all the bits you want on there. Next week I will be looking at the notion of relationships between elements. There's a whole idea that when you take a photo of that, whatever that is. If there's something else in the photo, there's automatically a relationship between these two things. The viewer cannot help but create a relationship. And the question is that relationship actually the story you're trying to make? Is it creating the right kind of relationship? Is there something accidental in there? You know, a bit like when Fergus had that red box in the background. It's drawing the attention. It's not actually contributing to the story. It's taking away from it. So you've got to think about the way elements are in a photo and how they're relating to each other. So next week I will be going much more in depth with that. That's us for this week. If you've not done already, please join the Facebook group Understanding Photography with Kim Ayres. Find those photos where you think, I could do with a little bit of help, or tell me about your sticking points. What makes it more difficult for you? I'm here to help. Let's see if we can get you take your photography up to the next level. So thanks very much. See you next week.